You are sentenced to 2 consecutive life imprisonment.
That sound is a period. A full stop at the end of a sentence that took 28 years to write. It is the sound of a circuit closing on a current of justice that has been dead for generations. In the moment that follows, all oxygen seems to leave the room. Every eye in the packed courtroom is locked on one man. David Miller. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't react at all. He simply stands there, a middle-aged man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, as the judge delivers the words that will seal him in a cage for the rest of his natural life. 2 life sentences. One for the life he took, and one for the decades of life he stole from everyone who loved her. As the judge speaks, detailing the heinous, calculated, and callous nature of his crime, David Miller's face is not a map of shame or fear. It is a blank, emotionless wall. And then, the corner of his mouth twitches. It's not a smile. It's something far more chilling. It's a flicker of pure, unadulterated annoyance. The petty, transient irritation of a man whose day has been mildly inconvenienced. This is not a tale of a monster who raged. This is the story of a man who saw a vibrant, beloved young woman, a woman with a name, a future, a soul, as nothing more than a problem to be solved. And after he solved that problem with brutal, intimate violence, he went home, had a beer, and built a life, forgetting about her as easily as you might forget a task you crossed off a list. For 28 years, he believed he had gotten away with the perfect crime. He was a father, a husband, a neighbor. He hid in the most brilliant camouflage of all, a life of boring normalcy. This is how he was caught. This is how the walls, silent and patient for nearly 3 decades, finally closed in. This is the story of a cold case that refused to stay cold, and the moment a killer who thought he was smart finally faced the terrifying weight of a truth that would not die. To understand the void, you must first see what was filled. To feel the fracture, you must remember the wholeness. So, let us rewind. Let us leave the sterile silence of the courtroom and travel back through the decades, to a time when the world felt softer, and the future for Sarah Bennett was not a closed file, but a boundless horizon. The year is 1995. The place is a suburb not unlike your own. It is a portrait of American tranquility in the final, innocent years before the digital deluge. The air in spring smells of cut grass and blooming lilacs. On weekends, the sound of lawnmowers provides a steady, humming bass line to the higher notes of children playing tag in cul-de-sacs. Front doors are left unlocked. Everyone knows everyone, or believes they do. And in a small, sun-drenched apartment on a quiet street, lives Sarah Bennett. She is 24 years old. To meet her is to be disarmed by a smile that seems to genuinely reach her eyes. She is not a celebrity, not a heiress. She is something more relatable and, in the context of what is to come, more devastating. She is ordinary in the most extraordinary way. She is a graduate student, poring over textbooks on educational theory, her highlighter running in yellow streaks across the pages. She works part-time at a local cafe, and she's the barista who remembers your usual order. Her apartment is a map of her mind. It is tidy, but alive. A thriving spider plant hangs in the kitchen window. Textbooks are stacked neatly on a desk, weighed down by a smooth, gray stone she found on a hike. The walls are adorned with her own artwork, watercolor landscapes that are competent, if not masterful, each one a testament to her desire to create beauty. On her bedside table, a well-thumbed copy of Maya Angelou's poetry rests next a journal. If you were to open it, you'd find not deep secrets, but the mundane magic of a life being lived. Reminders to buy milk, a funny thing a friend said, a dream about visiting Greece one day. She is, in essence, a collection of small, beautiful details. The scent of her perfume, a simple mix of vanilla and sandalwood. The way she hums absently when she's cooking. Her dedicated, slightly chaotic effort to learn the guitar, the chords from a Tracy Chapman song still clumsy under her fingers. She is a person in progress, a story still being written, every day a new sentence, a new paragraph. And on the periphery of her world, there is David Miller. He exists in the background of group photos, a faint smile on his lips that never quite reaches his placid eyes. He is 22. He works in a copy shop, a job he speaks of with a vague sense of resentment, as if it is a temporary stop on a grander journey he feels he deserves. To Sarah and her friends, he is just David. Quiet, a little awkward, harmless. He is a ghost at the feast of her life, a man whose own ambitions are curdling, unnoticed, into a profound sense of entitlement. He watches her. He notes her easy laughter with others, the way men are drawn to her light. He mistakes her inherent, friendly warmth for something more, or perhaps something less. In the pristine, ordered landscape of the suburb, Sarah Bennett is a burst of vibrant, authentic color. And David Miller is the one who, unable to paint with such colors, decides instead to blot it out. The facade, for both of them, is perfect. Hers is one of genuine joy and potential. His is one of benign normalcy, a mask that hides the slow, toxic drip of narcissistic injury. For one final, fleeting moment, under the gentle spring sun, the world is exactly as it appears. The chasm between the two has not yet been revealed. But the clock is ticking. The sun is beginning to set. The day began with sunlight. It streamed through Sarah Bennett's kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the warm air. It was a Tuesday, a day of small, predictable routines. For Sarah, this Tuesday was a canvas of small pleasures and minor errands. She had a late morning class, and she spent the early hours at her Formica kitchen table, a textbook open, a bowl of cereal going soggy beside it. She spoke to her mother on the phone, a conversation etched forever in a mother's memory. They talked about plans for the upcoming weekend, a family barbecue. Sarah promised to bring her famous potato salad. It was a mundane, beautiful conversation, the kind that forms the bedrock of a life. After the call, she met a friend for coffee. She was in good spirits, laughing about a disastrous date from the previous weekend, turning the awkwardness into a funny story. She talked about her student teaching assignment in the fall, the nervous excitement clear in her voice. She was, in those hours, the very picture of a young woman stepping confidently into her own future. Every laugh, every plan, was a thread in the tapestry of a life that was supposed to be long. While Sarah was living, David Miller was festering. His day was a study in grays and simmering resentment. He'd called in sick to the copy shop, the mere thought of the humiliating work fueling his sense of grievance. He paced his cramped apartment, a space that felt like a cage. His mind, a fertile ground for perceived slights, was fixated on Sarah. A memory, likely distorted by his own insecurity, played on a loop, a time she had politely declined his offer for a drink, a moment she had laughed in a group he felt excluded from. In his mind, these were not minor social interactions. They were profound insults, deliberate humiliations designed to undermine him. The narcissistic wound was not just bleeding, it was septic. As evening drew in, the two worlds, once parallel, began their fatal convergence. Sarah returned home. She changed into comfortable clothes, a worn-out university sweatshirt and jeans. She heated up a leftover pasta dish for dinner and sat on her sofa, a textbook on her lap, the Tracy Chapman songbook open beside her. She strummed a few chords, the notes imperfect but hopeful in the quiet of her apartment. She was safe. She was home. The knock on the door, when it came, was likely not alarming. A friend stopping by? A neighbor? She would have looked through the peephole and seen a face she recognized, a face from the periphery of her life. David Miller. Perhaps she felt a flicker of unease, but politeness, the social contract of a small community, would have overruled it. She opened the door. The violence that followed was not a frenzy. It was an intrusion, an erasure. It was the macabre contrast of a brutal act committed in a space of such tender, personal peace. The sound of struggle was swallowed by the insulated walls of the apartment building. A lamp was knocked over, its ceramic base shattering on the floor. A textbook was flung from the sofa, its pages splayed open. The vibrant, living space was violated in a matter of minutes. And then, silence. A silence more profound than before. The only sound now was the hum of the refrigerator, a mundane witness to the unimaginable. Outside, the suburb remained placid. A car drove past, its radio playing a popular song of the era. A dog barked in a distant yard. Families settled in for their nightly rituals of television and homework, completely unaware that the world next door had just been hollowed out, that a light had been snuffed, leaving behind only a terrible, growing dark. The perfect facade of the street remained intact. But behind one door, it had cracked, and from the fissure, a deep and lasting cold began to seep. This is the story of a life stolen, and a truth that refused to stay buried for 28 long years. It's a journey into the heart of a cold case, sustained only by a family's love and the relentless march of forensic science. If you are invested in seeing how justice finally caught up to a killer who believed he'd crafted the perfect crime, then your support is vital. Help us shed light on more stories like this. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Your engagement tells the algorithm that these stories matter, that these victims deserve to be remembered. It allows us to continue our mission, uncovering the truth, no matter how long it takes. Dispatcher, 911, what is your emergency? Yes. I need an ambulance. And the police. My friend. I think something's happened to my friend. The performance began at 10:17 p.m. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to David Miller. It was a masterpiece of manufactured panic. The breathlessness was there, but it was practiced, like an actor hitting his mark. The pauses were just a beat too long, as if he was thinking about what a panicked person would say next. He provided the address, Sarah's address, with a slight, convincing stammer. Dispatcher, what is the nature of the emergency, sir? Is she breathing? Miller, I don't know. I just got here. The door was unlocked. I called out and she didn't answer. I found her in the living room. There's blood. Oh God, there's so much blood. This was the lie, presented in its raw, foundational form. He was the concerned friend. The one who had just stumbled upon a nightmare. He was creating the scene for the first responders before they even arrived, directing their attention, shaping their reality. But within the performance, the first faint cracks were already audible to a trained ear. His tone was wrong. Beneath the performative shock, there was an eerie, metallic calm. There was none of the raw, gut-wrenching hysteria that typically accompanies such a discovery. His words were descriptive, not reactive. He said, "There is blood," not, "I see blood." A subtle but critical distinction that separates the observer from the participant. He was narrating a crime scene, not reacting to the violent end of someone he called a friend. He was also meticulously building his alibi. He stated he had just gotten there, establishing a timeline. He mentioned the unlocked door, explaining his own entry without force, a detail that would later become a critical point of contention. He was painting himself into the picture as a peripheral figure, a witness, while carefully omitting himself as the central actor. When the dispatcher asked for his name, he gave it without hesitation. David Miller. A guilty man might have hung up. A truly panicked one might have forgotten. David Miller provided it calmly, reinforcing his role as the helpful, if traumatized, Good Samaritan. It was a bold, narcissistic gamble. The belief that his performance was so flawless, so convincing, that his very presence at the scene would be seen as a coincidence, not a clue. As the sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, David Miller likely placed the phone back in its cradle. The first act of his play was over. He had set the stage. The false narrative was now the official record. He had, in those 2 minutes, weaponized his own normalcy. He was now a character in the story he had written, the grieving friend, the shocked discoverer. He would have taken a moment to compose his face, to ensure the mask of distress was perfectly in place before the police cars, their lights painting the quiet street in frantic pulses of red and blue, screeched to a halt outside. The first officers on the scene found him exactly as he'd presented himself, pale, shaken, standing outside the apartment as if unable to re-enter the horror. He was the first point of contact, the initial source of information. He was helpful. He was coherent. And in his eyes, had anyone looked closely enough past the act, they would have seen not the reflection of the tragedy before him, but the cold, calculated satisfaction of a director watching his play unfold exactly according to script. The lie was now alive, and it would haunt the case for the next 28 years. The first responders arrived to a scene staged for their benefit. The red and blue lights splashed against the neat, silent houses. David Miller stood on the sidewalk, a solitary figure etched in the artificial glow. He was the picture of shell-shocked concern, hugging his arms as if cold. He pointed a trembling hand toward the open door of Sarah Bennett's ground-floor apartment. The stage was set. The actors were in position. But veteran homicide detectives are not an audience. They are archaeologists of violence, trained to read the soil of a crime scene. And as the first two investigators, let's call them Detective Evans and Detective Morris, crossed the threshold, their instincts, honed by countless tragedies, began to prickle. The scene was wrong. It wasn't any one thing. It was a symphony of dissonant notes. The first note, the entry. David Miller had said the door was unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry, no splintered wood around the lock, no scratches on the deadbolt. This immediately suggested two possibilities. Either Sarah had been incredibly careless in a neighborhood she felt safe in, or she had opened the door for someone she knew. The latter possibility began to quietly coil in the detectives' minds. The second note, the disorder. The living room showed clear signs of a struggle, the overturned lamp, the scattered books. But the violence felt focused, personal. This wasn't the chaotic ransacking of a burglary. Nothing of obvious value was taken. A television sat undisturbed in the corner. A wallet, with a few dollars inside, was visible on a kitchen counter. The violence was the point. The third, and most chilling note, David Miller himself. Detective Evans observed him. He was performing grief, but his eyes were busy, scanning the room, tracking the officer's movements. He was too coherent, too ready with his answers. When asked what he was doing there, he said he'd just stopped by to return a book. It was a plausible, neighborly excuse. But when Evans glanced around the living room, he saw no book in Miller's hands, and none sitting by the door where one might have been dropped in shock. Then, the detective's attention was drawn to the heart of the horror, Sarah Bennett's body. The violence was intimate and brutal, the stuff of personal rage. But here, another wrong note echoed. The position of the body. It was off. It wasn't simply collapsed where she fell. There was a strange, almost deliberate arrangement to her limbs. It wasn't overtly theatrical, but it lacked the natural, chaotic repose of a body felled in a violent struggle. It was as if someone had, in the frantic moments after the act, moved her. Adjusted her. It was the subtle, unsettling signature of a killer still present, still manipulating the scene. Detective Morris's eyes then caught a glint near the sofa. A kitchen knife, lying on the carpet. It was clean. Too clean. It had been wiped. A weapon used in a frenzied attack, then carefully cleaned and placed on the floor? Why? Was it meant to be found? Was it a prop in the story the killer was trying to tell? A story of a mysterious intruder who conveniently left the murder weapon behind after taking the time to wipe it free of prints? The forensics team moved in, their flashbulbs popping, casting stark, momentary shadows. They documented everything. They bagged Sarah's hands for potential skin or hair trapped under her fingernails. They collected the knife. They took samples of the blood that stained the carpet, a dark, rust-colored bloom against the beige fibers. Throughout it all, David Miller remained. He was a fixture of the periphery, always available, always with the same story, delivered with the same rehearsed tremor. He was helpful, but his presence began to feel heavy, persistent. He wasn't a grieving friend being comforted. He was a source of information, constantly reinforcing his narrative. As the night wore on, the initial theory of a random violent break-in began to crumble under the weight of these inconsistencies. No forced entry. No theft. A cleaned weapon. A body that seemed subtly posed. And a witness who was a little too helpful, a little too calm beneath his performance. Detective Evans stood outside, the cool night air a relief from the cloying, metallic smell of the apartment. He looked at the peaceful, sleeping street, and then back at the lit doorway, a portal to a private hell. He turned to Morris, his voice low. "It's not adding up," he said. "The scene is too quiet. The violence is loud, but everything else is a whisper." He's lying. The false narrative, so confidently delivered in that 911 call, had developed its first hairline fracture. The killer had stayed to watch his play unfold. And in doing so, he had written himself into the script not as a bit player, but as the prime suspect. The hunt was no longer for a phantom intruder. It was now for the man standing in the spotlight, believing himself to be invisible. For 28 years, the most critical piece of evidence in the murder of Sarah Bennett existed in a state of suspended animation. It was not forgotten, but dormant. A single biological sample, a tiny, degraded speck of DNA recovered from under her fingernails, from a hair on her sweater, from a drop of sweat lost in the struggle, slept in a sealed evidence envelope inside a climate-controlled storage room. In 1995, it was a ghost, a clue without a name, a signature with no one to sign it. The technology to give it a voice simply did not exist. Then, science evolved. The breakthrough did not come with a clap of thunder, but with the quiet, persistent hum of a DNA sequencer in a private lab years later. This was the advent of forensic genetic genealogy, a tool so revolutionary it has rewritten the rules of cold case investigations. The process is as meticulous as it is brilliant. The old, degraded sample from Sarah's case was submitted. Scientists weren't looking for a direct match in a criminal database. They knew David Miller had no prior record. Instead, they used the sample to create a DNA profile, which was then uploaded to a public genealogy database, the same kind millions used to find their ancestors. The result was not a single, flashing red arrow pointing to the killer. It was a map. A constellation of distant, anonymous relatives, third cousins, half-great aunts, second cousins twice removed, all connected to the unknown contributor of that DNA sample. It was a family tree with the trunk and main branches missing. This is where the real detective work began. A genetic genealogist, a master of both science and family history, took this constellation and began to reverse engineer a lineage. It was a painstaking process of building out family trees for each of these DNA matches, looking for the single, shared ancestor that connected them all. It was a digital archaeology dig, sifting through census records, obituaries, and marriage certificates, building generations backwards in time until the separate branches began to converge. Slowly, a shape emerged from the fog. The separate family trees began to intertwine, their branches leading back to a common set of grandparents, then forward again through their descendants. The genealogist pruned the branches, eliminating those who were too old, too young, or geographically impossible. With each generation moving forward, the pool of potential suspects shrank. And then, there he was. A single name, sitting at the intersection of all this data, time, and place. A man who was the right age, who lived in the right area in 1995, and whose family tree perfectly fit the genetic puzzle. The ghost in the machine had a name: David Miller. The cold case detective, now holding a printout of this genealogical research, felt a jolt that only comes once or twice in a career. This wasn't a hunch. This wasn't a shaky eyewitness. This was a mathematical, scientific certainty pointing to one individual. The foundational clue, silent for nearly 3 decades, had finally spoken. But in a court of law, a family tree is not enough. The final, irrefutable link had to be forged. Under a judge's oversight, police began a period of discreet, physical surveillance on David Miller. They waited for him to discard something that carried his DNA. A coffee cup tossed in a public bin. A napkin wiped across his lips at a fast food restaurant. A cigarette butt. They obtained their sample. It was rushed to the state lab. The DNA from the discarded item was extracted and profiled. The technician then compared it directly to the old, haunted profile from the 1995 evidence sample. The result was not a probability. It was a fact. They were a perfect match. The killer had not been a phantom. He had been a neighbor, a father, a husband. He had been living just a short drive away, hiding in the most effective camouflage of all, a life of bland, unremarkable normalcy. The foundation of his freedom, which he believed to be made of stone, had just been revealed to be a house of cards. And the wind was about to blow. In the wake of a murder, a home becomes a crime scene. It is measured, photographed, and dusted for fingerprints. Every object is treated as evidence, a potential clue to the mechanics of a death. But if you look past the yellow tape and the evidence markers, these objects are something else entirely. They are relics. They are the artifacts of a life interrupted. As the investigation spun its wheels in 1995, and again as it was revived decades later, detectives were tasked with understanding Sarah Bennett. And to do that, they had to walk through her world, frozen in time. Her apartment was not just a location, it was a portrait. The first thing you'd notice, beyond the grim evidence of violence, was the light. She kept her curtains open. She positioned her sofa to catch the afternoon sun. This was not the home of someone who lived in fear, it was the home of someone who embraced the day. Detective Evans, in the original investigation, stood in her kitchen. He saw the thriving spider plant, its tendrils cascading down the side of the fridge. It was healthy, well-watered. A small thing, but it spoke to a nurturing spirit, a commitment to life. On the counter, a mug sat in the sink, the ghost of coffee grounds at the bottom. She had expected to wake up and wash it. She had expected a tomorrow. In her living room, her guitar leaned against the wall near the sofa. The Tracy Chapman songbook was still open on the stand, the page for Fast Car dog-eared. The detectives could almost hear the fumbling, hopeful chords she'd been practicing, the sound of someone trying to wrap their hands around a dream. It was a dream of mastery, of being able to create something beautiful from 6 strings and her own determination. Then, there were the books. Not just textbooks on educational theory, filled with her diligent underlining, but a well-loved collection of novels on a shelf. Mary Oliver's poetry, filled with lines about the beauty of the natural world. A Barbara Kingsolver novel about family and resilience. These were not random choices, they were a map of her inner life, a life that valued depth, connection, and the quiet power of the everyday. On her desk, next to a stack of unpaid bills, was a sketchpad. Flipping through it, a detective would find delicate pencil drawings of the old oak tree in her parents' backyard, a series of playful, cartoonish animals, and half-finished plans for a children's book. The drawings were good. They had warmth and a sure, steady line. They were the first drafts of a future she was actively building, a future where her art and her desire to teach children would merge. And the photographs. Tucked into the edge of her mirror, pinned to a corkboard. Sarah, laughing with her arms around friends on a hiking trail, her face flushed with sun and joy. A goofy picture with her mother, both of them making faces at the camera. A formal portrait from her college graduation, the cap tilted at a proud, slightly rebellious angle. Each object was a silent testament to a person who was fully, vibrantly engaged in the act of living. The spider plant was a promise she intended to keep. The guitar was a challenge she was determined to meet. The sketches were a future she was actively designing. For the detectives, this was the most painful part of the investigation. They weren't just cataloging evidence. They were taking an inventory of a stolen future. They were meeting the real Sarah Bennett, the one David Miller never saw. He saw an object, a supporting character in the story of his own life. But in this quiet, sunlit apartment, she was the undisputed protagonist of her own rich, complex, and beautiful narrative. A narrative he had arrogantly, and permanently, deleted. The objects in Sarah's apartment told one story, a story of a life in progress. But to truly hear her voice, to understand the echo she left in the world, you must listen to those who loved her. In the initial investigation of 1995, and again during the renewed push for justice decades later, detectives sat with Sarah's family and friends. They opened old yearbooks and photo albums, and in doing so, they opened a window into a soul. Her mother's voice, even years later, would soften and break when recalling the small things. She had a stubborn streak a mile wide, she would say, a watery laugh escaping. If she believed in something, you couldn't budge her. I used to get so frustrated, but now I admire it. That was her moral compass. It was unshakable. She described a daughter who would spend hours patiently helping a struggling classmate, but who would also fiercely debate a point of principle at the dinner table. This wasn't just a memory. It was the fingerprint of Sarah's character. Her best friend, the one from the coffee shop on her last day, provided the vibrant color to the portrait. She was the funniest person I knew, but not in a tell-jokes way, she recalled. It was her observations. The way she could pinpoint the absolute absurdity in a situation and just nail it. You'd be crying laughing. She spoke of late-night talks, of dreams so big they felt tangible. We vowed we'd save up and buy a crappy old sailboat and just sail around the Mediterranean. We had it all planned. She was going to paint the landscapes, and I was going to write about them. It was our ridiculous, beautiful plan. That plan, now a ghost of a future, highlighted the devastating theft of potential. Other voices joined the chorus. A professor remembered her as insightful and fiercely curious, never taking the text at face value. A co-worker from the cafe said, "She was the one who remembered your name. Not just your coffee order, but if you'd had a big job interview, she'd ask how it went." She made everyone feel seen. Through these shared memories, a fully dimensional person emerges from the shadow of victim. We learned she was terrified of spiders but would carefully capture them in a cup to release outside. She was a terrible singer but sang loudly in the car anyway. She burned toast with remarkable consistency. She loved the feeling of cold sheets on a hot night and the smell of rain on hot asphalt. These are the mundane, magnificent details that constitute a human life. They are the things David Miller either never saw or willfully ignored. He saw a prop. Her friends and family saw a universe. The void her death left was not a single, neat hole. It was a fractal of absences. It was the empty chair at every family holiday for 30 years. It was the best friend who never found another confidant quite like her. It was the children in a classroom who never had the teacher who would have changed their lives. It was the silence where her laughter should have been. The investigation had its evidence, its timelines, its motive. But this collective memory, this enduring love, was the heart of the case. It was the why for the detectives, the prosecutors, the family. It was the fuel for the long, cold decades. They weren't just solving a puzzle. They were fighting for the meaning of a life that had been so carelessly and so cruelly erased. They were ensuring that Sarah Bennett's voice, though silenced, would never truly be gone. To understand the how of a crime is a matter of forensics. To understand the why is to journey into the deepest, most disordered corridors of the human psyche. With David Miller, the clues did not point to greed or to a crime of passionate rage. They pointed to something colder, more insidious, and far more common: pathological narcissism. This is not mere vanity or self-importance. It is a profound psychiatric condition, a structural flaw in the very architecture of the self. A pathological narcissist possesses a grandiose, yet incredibly fragile, sense of self-worth. They see other people not as autonomous beings with their own thoughts and feelings, but as mere extensions of themselves, as instruments to be used for validation, or as obstacles to be removed. They are the sun in their own universe, and everyone else is a celestial body whose only purpose is to orbit and reflect their light. For David Miller, Sarah Bennett was not a person. She was a source of what psychologists call narcissistic supply. Her attention, her admiration, her very existence, was meant to feed his ego. When she, likely through a simple, polite rejection or a moment of inattention, failed to provide that supply, she ceased to be a person in his eyes. She became a threat. This is the core of the narcissistic injury, a perceived slight that strikes at the very core of their fragile self-image. For a healthy person, a rejection is disappointing, perhaps even hurtful. For a pathological narcissist, it is an existential cataclysm. It is not just an insult, it is an annihilation. The grandiosity collapses, revealing the terrifying emptiness beneath. The shame and rage that floods in is intolerable. And the narcissistic psyche has a primitive, brutal defense mechanism for this intolerable feeling: narcissistic rage. This is not hot, impulsive anger. It is a cold, calculated, and often disproportionate response aimed at utterly destroying the source of the injury. The goal is to eradicate the perceived threat and restore the narcissist's sense of power and superiority. In Miller's distorted reality, Sarah had to be punished for the crime of making him feel insignificant. By erasing her, he was, in his mind, erasing the feeling of worthlessness she had provoked in him. Her murder was not about ending her life, it was about repairing his fractured ego. This psychological framework explains every chilling aspect of his behavior. It explains the lack of remorse. Empathy is a foreign language to the pathological narcissist. They cannot comprehend the pain of others because others are not real to them. Sarah's death was a solution to his problem, not a tragedy. It explains the double life. Maintaining the facade of a normal husband and father was simply him securing a new, stable source of narcissistic supply. His family were actors in the play of his life, their purpose to reflect back to him the image of a successful, normal man. It explains the calm during the 911 call and the crime scene. He wasn't panicked because he was in control. He was the director of the drama, carefully staging the scene to protect his most important asset, himself. The performance was the reality. The why of Sarah Bennett's murder, therefore, is both profoundly complex and terrifyingly simple. She was not killed for money, for jealousy, or for love. She was killed because a pathologically narcissistic man perceived her as a mirror reflecting back an image of himself he could not tolerate. And so, he shattered the mirror. The tragedy is that he saw only the broken glass, and never the vibrant, human life that it had reflected. The most perfect prison is one the inmate doesn't know they're in. For 28 years, David Miller lived inside a prison of his own construction, a panopticon of normalcy where he was both the warden and the most closely watched inmate. While the ghost of Sarah Bennett haunted a cold case file, Miller was building his alibi in real time, layering year upon year of mundane life over a single hidden night of monstrous violence. To the outside world, his life was a study in suburban blandness. He married a woman we'll call Karen, a kind, straightforward person who saw in him a stable, if somewhat detached, partner. He held a steady, mid-level job in data management, a fitting career for a man who preferred the order of numbers to the chaos of human emotion. He attended parent-teacher conferences, coached his son's little league team for a season, and hosted awkward but predictable barbecues. He was a ghost in his own life, present in body but always seeming to observe the proceedings from a slight, unbridgeable distance. His home was a testament to this curated existence. It was clean, tidy, and sterile. There were no vibrant spider plants, no half-finished songbooks. The decor was chosen for its inoffensiveness, not its passion. It was a showroom, not a home. Friends of his wife would describe him as quiet and a bit reserved. They'd say, he dotes on Karen, but if pressed, they'd struggle to recall a specific, genuine moment of affection between them. The relationship was a performance of a marriage, a script he followed diligently. But beneath this placid surface, the real David Miller, the one capable of narcissistic rage, was always present, just in a different form. He maintained control not through overt violence, but through subtle, psychological means. He was a master of passive aggression. He would promise to handle a chore and then forget, forcing Karen to shoulder the mental load. He would offer backhanded compliments that left her feeling vaguely diminished. He created a world where his comfort was the central priority, and his family learned to orbit around his moods, which could shift from bland affability to cold, silent withdrawal without warning. This was the double life. Not one of secret affairs or clandestine bank accounts, but a life split between a meticulously constructed facade and a hollow, controlling core. The man who could violently erase a human life for a perceived slight was the same man who could calmly lecture his son on the importance of good sportsmanship. The pathology didn't disappear. It simply adapted, finding new, quieter ways to dominate and control. He never spoke of Sarah Bennett. He never drank too much and confessed. He never showed a flicker of recognition when her unsolved case was occasionally mentioned in the local news on the anniversary of her death. His secret wasn't a burden he carried. It was a trophy he kept in a locked room in his mind. It was the ultimate proof of his own superiority, that he was smart enough, controlled enough to get away with it. He believed his double life was a perfect camouflage. And in a way, it was. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in the light, camouflaged by the boring, predictable patterns of a middle-class father and husband. He had committed the perfect crime not because he left no evidence, but because he had woven himself so completely into the fabric of an ordinary life that no one thought to look for a monster in the thread. The perfect alibi wasn't a story he told. It was a life he lived, day after mundane day, for 28 years. A life that was, in its own way, just another form of the lie he told on the 911 call. A lie told not with words, but with years. With David Miller's name now blazing like a neon sign from the genetic genealogy report, the investigation transformed. It was no longer a question of who. It was a mission to prove what he did. And in the modern era, that proof begins in the digital realm, a landscape where every click, every search, every digital footprint becomes a silent witness. The detectives began constructing the first layer of their unassailable pyramid, the digital evidence. The first and most monumental block was, of course, the DNA match. The genetic handshake between the 1995 evidence and the DNA from Miller's discarded coffee cup was the cornerstone. This was no longer a theory. It was a scientific fact, a binary yes/no question to which the universe had answered yes. He was there. His biological material was on and around Sarah Bennett at the time of her death. This single piece of data rendered his entire, "I just found her" narrative physically impossible. But a pyramid needs more than a cornerstone. The detectives, armed with search warrants, began excavating Miller's digital life, both past and present. They started with his recent history, looking for signs of a guilty conscience. What they found was more telling than a confession. In the weeks leading up to his arrest, David Miller's internet search history became a map of mounting paranoia. He wasn't searching for how to live with guilt. He was searching for how long does DNA evidence last, and forensic genetic genealogy cold cases. He typed statute of limitations murder into his search bar, a futile query for a crime that has no expiration date. These were not the searches of an innocent man. They were the frantic calculations of a man who felt the walls, built by advancing science, beginning to close in. He was checking the structural integrity of his own prison. The investigation then reached back in time, using old phone records and witness statements to digitally map his life in 1995. They confirmed his number was in Sarah's address book. They placed his general location in the same suburb through cell tower data, crude by today's standards, but another point of spatial alignment. They found people from their shared social circle who confirmed Miller had known Sarah, that he had been at parties with her, that he had, in the words of one, a bit of a thing for her. This digital and social triangulation placed him firmly within her orbit, giving context to the DNA. Perhaps the most chilling piece of digital evidence, however, came from an unexpected source: the victim herself. In a twist of cruel irony, the detectives learned that Sarah Bennett, a woman embracing the technology of her time, had owned one of the early, clunky versions of a personal fitness tracker. While it didn't continuously sync to a cloud, its internal data, recovered by forensic experts, told a story of its own. The device recorded a spike in her heart rate, a rapid, frantic ascent, followed by a sudden flatline cessation of all movement at the exact time of the murder. It was a digital timestamp of her final, terrified moments, a silent scream captured in data. This digital layer of the pyramid was cold, factual, and utterly damning. It wasn't based on hunches or conflicting testimonies. It was built on the unfeeling, objective language of ones and zeros. The DNA placed him at the scene. His search history revealed a consciousness of guilt. The digital footprint of the victim confirmed the timeline of the atrocity. Together, they formed a solid, irrefutable base of facts. David Miller, in his arrogance, never considered that his own curiosity and the victim's embrace of technology would become the very things that would help convict him. The digital ghosts had begun to testify. While the digital evidence provided the cold, hard facts of David Miller's presence and guilt, the psychological evidence provided the story. This second layer of the pyramid was built not from databases and DNA sequencers, but from human memory, from the lingering, unsettling impressions he left on those around him in 1995. It was the layer that gave context to the crime, painting a portrait of the man capable of the murder, long before science could prove he'd committed it. Detectives, now with Miller as their focal point, re-examined old witness statements through a new, clarifying lens. The vague unease that investigators felt in 1995 now crystallized into a clear pattern of predatory behavior. A former friend from the social circle recalled a specific, chilling incident. "We were at a party at Sarah's apartment a few weeks before it happened. David was there, hovering near her. She was being her usual friendly self, but you could see she was trying to gently disengage. At one point, she laughed at a joke someone else told, and David's face just went flat. It was like a switch flipped. No anger, just this cold, dead look. It only lasted a second, but I never forgot it." Another witness, a woman Miller had briefly dated before focusing on Sarah, described a similar controlling chill. "He wasn't overtly abusive," she said. "It was the questions. Why were you talking to him so long? You think he's funnier than me? He had this way of making you feel like you were constantly auditioning for the role of his girlfriend, and always failing. When I broke it off, he didn't yell. He just said, "You'll realize you made a mistake." And then he never spoke to me again. This was the echo of narcissistic injury and the precursor to narcissistic rage. The witnesses were describing the exact psychological mechanism that would later drive him to violence. His ego was a tripwire, and Sarah Bennett had inadvertently stumbled over it. The detectives also learned more about his actions in the days surrounding the murder. He had called in sick to work, not just on the day of the murder, but the day after. He was giving himself a window, a space to act, and then to recover and establish his alibi. In the week following the killing, co-workers noted he was weirdly calm amid the community-wide shock and grief. While others were emotional, Miller was detached, almost analytical, asking pointed questions about the police investigation's progress. Perhaps the most telling psychological clue was his post-murder behavior towards Sarah's friends. He didn't avoid them. Instead, he inserted himself. He attended the vigil, offering hollow, rehearsed-sounding condolences. He asked probing questions, feigning concern, but really gauging how much the police knew. He was managing the narrative, just as he had on the 911 call, performing the role of the grieving friend while secretly monitoring the investigation he had spawned. This layer of psychological evidence was crucial. It showed propensity. It demonstrated that the capacity for this specific type of violence, rooted in wounded pride and a need for control, was present in David Miller long before the night he acted on it. The witnesses weren't describing a random, kind-hearted man who snapped. They were describing a man with a fragile, monstrous ego, for whom a woman's autonomy was an insult. Their collective memories formed a psychological fingerprint, and it perfectly matched the profile of the killer. The digital evidence said he was there. The psychological evidence answered the terrifying question. He was always the kind of man who would be. The digital evidence placed him at the scene. The psychological evidence revealed his motive. But the final unassailable layer of the pyramid was built in the silent, fluorescent-lit world of the crime lab. This was the realm of the tangible, the blood, the fibers, the unyielding physics of a violent act. The forensic evidence didn't just point to David Miller. It screamed his name, and it utterly dismantled his carefully constructed lie. The centerpiece was, and always would be, the DNA. But now, with Miller identified, the context of that DNA became devastating. The sample recovered from under Sarah Bennett's fingernails, a classic sign of a victim fighting for her life, was his. This was not the transfer of a casual hug or a handshake. This was violent, defensive contact. It placed him not as a bystander, but as the person she was desperately trying to fight off in her final moments. The same DNA was found on a hair recovered from her sweater, and in a drop of sweat on the carpet near her body. The genetic evidence painted a picture of an intimate, brutal struggle. Then, there was the murder weapon, the kitchen knife, found wiped clean on the floor. The absence of fingerprints was, in itself, evidence. A random intruder or a crime of passion does not typically pause to meticulously wipe down a weapon. This was a deliberate act of staging, an attempt to mislead. And while the blade was clean, the handle, made of a porous material, might have still held trace DNA, but Miller had worn gloves, another sign of premeditation. The very cleanliness of the knife was a testament to his guilty consciousness. The blood spatter analysis told a story that contradicted Miller's 911 call. The patterns on the carpet and the nearby furniture indicated a sustained, close-range attack. There was no evidence of a standoff or a struggle with a stranger that would have created a different spatter pattern. The blood evidence was consistent with a personal, face-to-face assault, exactly the kind that would occur when a victim confronts an acquaintance they had allowed into their home. Trace evidence further wove the narrative. Fibers consistent with the type of carpet in Miller's 1995 apartment were found on Sarah's floor, transferred from his shoes or clothing. A single minuscule chip of paint, matching the color of his car at the time, was discovered near the curb outside her apartment. These were silent, physical witnesses that placed his world inside of hers. Finally, the lack of forced entry was a forensic fact in its own right. The door, the lock, the frame, all were examined and showed no signs of tampering. This single, uncontested fact destroyed any possibility of a random intruder. It proved Sarah Bennett had opened her door to someone she knew. When combined with the DNA under her fingernails, it created an inescapable logical loop. She let him in, and then she fought him for her life. This forensic layer was the capstone of the pyramid. It was objective, physical, and brutal in its clarity. It turned the abstract, motive, opportunity, into the concrete. The digital evidence gave them a name. The psychological evidence gave them a reason. But the forensic evidence gave them the crime itself, frozen in time. It was the unshakable foundation upon which the entire case rested, a monument to the truth built from the very molecules of the tragedy. The pyramid was now complete, and it pointed with absolute certainty to one man, trapping him in a tomb of his own making. The case file was no longer a collection of dusty folders and fading reports. It was a living entity, a breathing organism of evidence. The three layers of the pyramid, digital, psychological, forensic, were now fused together, forming a single unassailable structure of truth. For the cold case team, the quiet, methodical work of years had reached its crescendo. The puzzle was complete. Every piece was locked into place, and the picture it revealed was of David Miller, standing over Sarah Bennett's body. There were no more questions. No more loose ends to tug. The genetic genealogy had given them the man. The digital footprint revealed his consciousness of guilt. The psychological profile exposed his motive. The forensic evidence placed him in a violent, intimate struggle with the victim. His own lies, told in 1995 and preserved in brittle police transcripts, now read like a confession in reverse. The prosecutor reviewed the monumental file, nodding slowly. It was more than enough for a conviction. It was a tidal wave of evidence. The warrant was drafted with cool, precise language, outlining the pyramid in stark, legal terms. The charge: murder in the first degree. The arrest was planned with tactical precision. They would not storm his house in a chaotic, televised spectacle. They would take him quietly, clinically, mirroring the cold calculation he had shown. Surveillance confirmed his routine. Leave for work at 7:45 a.m., alone. They would box in his car a block from his home, on a quiet tree-lined street not unlike the one where Sarah Bennett had lived. The irony was not lost on them. On a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week Sarah had been murdered, the team assembled. There was no dramatic speech. Just a series of quiet confirmations over the radio. They were not there for vengeance, but for resolution. For the delivery of a long-overdue invoice, from the past to the present. As David Miller finished his breakfast, kissed his wife goodbye, and stepped out into the morning air, he believed he was the same man he had been the day before. A free man. A man who had won. He did not see the unmarked cars. He did not sense the walls that had been built around him, stone by evidentiary stone, over 28 years. He started his car, pulled out of his driveway, and turned onto the peaceful street, completely unaware that for him, the world was about to shrink to the size of a prison cell. The long, patient hunt was over. The takedown had begun. The morning was utterly ordinary. The sun cast long, gentle shadows across manicured lawns. David Miller, now a man in his late 40s, backed his sedan out of the driveway of the home he shared with his wife. He wore a neutral expression, his mind likely already on the day's mundane tasks, a meeting, emails, the predictable rhythm of a life he had built on a foundation of lies. He turned onto the quiet residential street, a route he had driven thousands of times. He did not make it to the stop sign. With a quiet, coordinated efficiency that was breathtaking, the unmarked cars converged. One slid in front of him, blocking his path. Another pulled up tight behind his bumper, sealing him in. There was no squealing of tires, no dramatic shout. The doors of the vehicles opened and detectives emerged, their movements calm and deliberate. Detective Evans, now grayer but with the same sharp eyes that had scanned Sarah Bennett's apartment 28 years prior, approached the driver's side door. He tapped on the window. Inside, David Miller flinched, his head snapping toward the sound. For a single unguarded moment, his face was a blank slate of pure, animal confusion. Then, just as quickly, the mask of bland normalcy slid back into place. He rolled down the window. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone one of mild, bureaucratic annoyance, as if he were being inconvenienced by a parking attendant. "David Miller?" Evans said, though it wasn't a question. Yes. Please turn off the vehicle and step out. There was no struggle. No cries of protest. He complied with the quiet, mechanical obedience of a man who had been rehearsing this moment in the back of his mind for decades. As he stepped out onto the asphalt, his hands were secured behind his back with cold, hard steel. The detectives recited his Miranda rights, the words echoing in the still morning air. Neighbors began to peek through blinds, drawn by the unusual, silent activity. This was the moment of reckoning, the collapse of a 28-year facade. And in that moment, David Miller did not break. He did not weep. He did not ask why, or proclaim his innocence. His effect was profoundly, terrifyingly flat. He looked at the detectives not with fear or anger, but with a vacant, almost analytical curiosity, as if he were a scientist observing the predictable result of a long-running experiment. He was placed in the back of an unmarked car. He did not look back at his house. He did not ask to speak to his wife. He simply sat, staring straight ahead, his body rigid, his face an emotionless mask. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet street to its morning peace. The arrest was anticlimactic. There was no grand battle, no final, dramatic confrontation. It was an administrative procedure, a clinical extraction. But in its very banality lay its own profound horror. It was the final, undeniable proof that David Miller was not a man of passion, but of calculation. Even the loss of his freedom, the utter destruction of his carefully constructed world, could not provoke a genuine human response. The monster wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was sitting in the back of a sedan, quietly, on his way to jail. The interrogation room is a world unto itself, designed to disorient and disarm. It is a sterile, sound-deadened box. The walls are a faded, institutional green, scuffed and marked with the ghosts of 1,000 past confrontations. A single, flickering fluorescent light hums overhead, casting a pale, surgical glow that washes out color and deepens shadows. The air smells of stale coffee, antiseptic cleaner, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. In the center of the room sits a bolted-down metal table, its surface etched with the unintentional graffiti of nervous fingernails. 2 chairs face each other across it, one for the hunter, one for the prey. David Miller sits in the hard, plastic chair, his cuffed hands resting on the cold table. He has had hours to sit in the holding cell, to compose himself, to rebuild the mask. He looks calm. Annoyed, perhaps, like a busy man whose schedule has been disrupted. His posture is erect, but not rigid. He is playing the part of the confused, law-abiding citizen, waiting for this ridiculous misunderstanding to be cleared up. Detective Evans enters, followed by his partner. Evans carries a simple folder. He does not slam it on the table. He places it down gently, a silent promise of what is inside. He takes the seat opposite Miller. He says nothing for a long moment, his eyes studying the man, not as a specimen, but as a long-awaited conclusion. "David," Evans begins, his voice calm, almost conversational. "We've been down a long road to get to this room. 28 years long." Miller meets his gaze. "I don't know what this is about. You arrested me in front of my neighbors. My wife, she must be terrified." The performance is flawless. The concern for his wife, the indignation at the public spectacle. It is the opening move in a psychological chess match. "This is about Sarah Bennett," Evans says, the name hanging in the sterile air. Miller's brow furrows in a perfect pantomime of confusion. "Sarah? That was a lifetime ago. A tragedy. But I don't see what that has to do with me now." "You were the one who found her, David. You made the 911 call. You were the last person to see her alive." Evans is stating facts, not accusations. He is laying out the board. "I was a kid," Miller replies, shaking his head with a practiced weariness. "I was trying to help. I told the police everything I knew back then. It was a home invasion, wasn't it? Some random monster." Evans leans forward, just slightly. "That's the thing, David. We don't think it was random anymore. The scene was wrong. You said the door was unlocked. There was no forced entry. Nothing was taken. Miller doesn't flinch. She was careless sometimes. She felt safe. He is using the victim's own perceived character as a shield, a chillingly casual deflection. For an hour, the dance continues. Evans presents a piece of the old puzzle: the clean knife, the lack of a random struggle, the specific nature of the violence. Each time, Miller has a calm, plausible, and utterly false answer. He is not arguing. He is narrating. He is retelling the story he crafted in 1995, believing it to be invulnerable. He is the star of his own production, and the detectives are his captive audience. But Evans is not there to debate the old facts. He is there to set the stage for the new ones. He lets Miller talk. He lets him embed himself deeper and deeper into his own lie. With every rehearsed sentence, David Miller is building the cage around himself, convinced all the while that he is constructing a fortress. The interrogation room is quiet, but the air is electric with the unsaid, with a monumental weight of the evidence waiting in that thin, manila folder. The chess pieces are in their opening positions. The endgame is about to begin. The dance of lies had reached its end. Detective Evans had listened patiently, letting David Miller entrench himself in his decades-old narrative. He had watched the man's calm, almost smug demeanor, the confident delivery of a story he'd told himself 10,000 times. Now, it was time to introduce a character Miller had never written into his script: science. Evans leaned back in his chair, the gesture casual, but his eyes were locked on Miller. You know, David, for 28 years, your story was the only one we had. It was the foundation. But foundations can be tested. He slowly pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder. It was the summary report from the genetic genealogist. The world moved on, David. But your case didn't. It just got colder. Until a few years ago, when we decided to take another look at the evidence. Not with new witnesses, but with new eyes. Scientific eyes. Miller's mask of polite confusion remained, but a new wariness entered his eyes. He said nothing. We had a DNA sample from the scene, Evans continued, his voice flat and factual. For decades, it was just a useless string of code. But then, we used a new technique. It's called forensic genetic genealogy. He let the term hang in the air. Miller's blink was a fraction too slow. The first, nearly imperceptible crack. It's fascinating, really, Evans said, almost conversationally. You can take an unknown DNA sample and, by comparing it to public databases, build an entire family tree for the person who left it. You can find their second cousins, their great-aunts, all anonymously. It's like having a map to a hidden treasure, and all you have to do is follow the branches. Evans tapped the paper. We followed the branches, David. 4 months. It led us to a family. A big, sprawling family with roots all over this state. And as we built that tree out, generation by generation, and then started pruning the branches, eliminating the women, the men who were too old, too young, or lived 1,000 miles away, the list of possible names got smaller. And smaller. Miller had gone very still. The affected posture of relaxed annoyance was gone. He was now a statue, his cuffed hands clenched together on the table. And then, Evans said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, there was only one name left. One person who was the right age, in the right place, at the right time. One person whose branch on that family tree ended at the doorstep of Sarah Bennett's apartment in 1995. He paused, letting the silence stretch, allowing the implication to coil around the man across the table. It was you, David. The mask shattered. It didn't fall. It evaporated. The feigned confusion, the smug patience, the performative annoyance, it all vanished, replaced by a raw, primal blankness. The blood drained from his face, leaving a waxy, pale complexion. His jaw went slack. For the first time, David Miller was not performing. He was simply unmade. We didn't stop there, of course, Evans continued, his tone still lethally calm. We needed to be sure. So we watched you. We waited. And we got a coffee cup you threw away. We tested the DNA on that cup. Evans now pulled the final sheet from the folder. It was the lab report from the state crime lab. He didn't slide it across the table. He simply held it up, a silent, damning verdict. It was a match. A perfect match. The DNA you left at the scene, the DNA under Sarah Bennett's fingernails as she fought for her life, is your DNA, David. There is no statistical doubt. It's you. The sound that escaped David Miller's lips was not a word. It was a hollow, shuddering exhale, the sound of a soul collapsing in on itself. His shoulders slumped, his entire body deflating as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He stared at the report in Evans's hand, not seeing the paper, but seeing the end of everything. The perfect crime, the perfect life, the perfect lie, it was all gone, obliterated by a science he never saw coming. The gotcha moment was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no table pounding. It was a quiet, surgical annihilation. The unassailable truth of a DNA profile had done what decades of suspicion could not. It had stripped David Miller bare, revealing the terrified, pathetic man hiding behind 28 years of a meticulously crafted facade. The chess match was over. Checkmate. The collapse was total. For nearly a minute, David Miller did not speak. He stared at the grain of the metal table, his body slack, his mind undoubtedly reeling through the implications of that DNA report. The fortress had fallen, and he was now exposed in the rubble. But a pathological narcissist does not surrender. They pivot. They do not confess to a crime. They justify an action. When he finally looked up, his eyes were different. The blank shock had been replaced by a simmering, wounded resentment. The performance was over, but the pathology was now speaking in its raw, unfiltered voice. "She shouldn't have laughed," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Detective Evans remained perfectly still, a neutral witness. "What shouldn't she have laughed at, David?" "At the party," he continued, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "There was a party, a couple weeks before. I was talking. I was making a point. And she laughed. Not with me. At me. She turned to her friend and she laughed, like I was some joke." This was the narcissistic injury, fossilized in his memory for 28 years. Not a violent argument, not a heated confrontation. A laugh. A perceived social slight that had festered into a mortal wound. "So you were angry," Evans stated, not asking. "It wasn't about anger," Miller snapped, a flash of irritation in his eyes. "It was about respect. She thought she was better than everyone. With her perfect little life, her perfect little apartment, her future." He spat the word as if it were a curse. "She walked around like she was royalty, and the rest of us were just there. For her amusement." He was now fully embodying the role of the victim. In his twisted narrative, he was the one who had been wronged. Sarah Bennett's very existence, her vibrancy, her potential, her social ease, was an affront to his own fragile ego. Her murder was not a tragedy. It was a cosmic correction. "I went over there that night to talk to her," he explained, his tone shifting to one of righteous justification. "To make her understand. I just wanted her to see. But she was so condescending. She opened the door and she had that same look on her face. That smug, dismissive look. She told me to leave." He leaned forward, his cuffed hands clenching again, but this time with fervor, not fear. "She couldn't just do that. You can't treat people that way. You can't make someone feel like nothing and just close the door." Detective Evans listened, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but inside, he was witnessing the terrifying core of the crime. This was not a confession of murder. It was a manifesto of entitlement. David Miller was describing the annihilation of a human life as if it were a logical, almost inevitable, response to a bruised ego. "So what happened then, David?" Evans asked, his voice dangerously calm. "She wouldn't listen." Miller's voice rose, tinged with a whining, petulant rage. "She started to get scared, tried to push the door closed. But I was stronger. I had to make her listen. I had to make her see what she had done. The it was the violent struggle. The it was the murder." He could not even name the action, only the provocation. He was the hero of his own story, forced to take drastic measures to reclaim his usurped dignity. In that moment, the interrogation room was no longer about a criminal case. It was a window into a profound human void. David Miller was showing them the chilling arithmetic of his soul, that Sarah Bennett's life was a price he was willing to pay to soothe the unbearable itch of his own insecurity. He had not killed a person, he had eliminated a problem. And as he sat back, a strange, unsettling calm settling over him, it was clear he still believed, on some deep pathological level, that his justification was valid. The monster wasn't in the rage, it was in the reason. Detective Evans let the silence stretch. He let the petulant echo of Miller's words, "She couldn't just do that," fade into the room's sterile hum. He had the confession. He had the motive. But he needed one thing more. He needed the capstone. The single unvarnished sentence that would encapsulate the entire, horrifying philosophy of the man sitting across from him. Evans leaned forward, his voice low, devoid of judgment, a tool designed to pry open the deepest vault. "David," he said almost gently, "you've told us why you felt you had to do it. You've told us your reason. But I need you to say it. In your own words. What did you do to Sarah Bennett when she wouldn't listen?" Miller looked at him, his eyes clear now, emptied of the performative rage. What was left was something colder, a flat, transactional understanding. The game was up. The truth was out. Now, it was just about stating the final terms. He didn't speak for a long moment. He seemed to be turning the question over in his mind, not as a painful memory, but as a logical equation. He was distilling his entire warped justification into its purest, most concentrated form. Then he looked directly at Evans, his gaze unervingly steady. "I fixed the problem," David Miller said. The words were delivered not with pride, nor with shame, but with the calm, declarative tone of a mechanic stating he'd repaired an engine. "I fixed the problem." In that one, chilling sentence, the entire case was summarized. The life of Sarah Bennett, with all her dreams, her laughter, her love, her potential, was reduced to a single word, a problem. Her humanity was erased. Her existence was merely an inconvenient variable in the equation of David Miller's ego. And his solution to the problem of his own fragile self-worth was to permanently delete the person he believed had caused it. The room went colder. Detective Evans, a man who had heard every conceivable horror, felt a fresh chill settle in his bones. This was beyond sociopathy. This was a profound, philosophical void. It was the logic of a God complex, applied to the life of an innocent woman. There was no follow-up question. There was nothing more to ask. The damning statement had been made. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a sob. It was a mission statement. I fixed the problem. The words hung in the air, a toxic cloud that would forever define him. They were the ultimate confession, not to the act of murder, but to the mindset that made it possible. They revealed a man for whom other people were not souls, but software, glitchy programs to be debugged or, if necessary, terminated. In the end, David Miller wasn't just a killer. He was a man who saw the world as a series of problems, and himself as the only solution. And in that terrifying self-assessment, he had signed his own damnation, in ink that would never fade. The transition from the sterile, controlled silence of the interrogation room to the cacophony of the outside world was abrupt and brutal. David Miller, now formally charged with first-degree murder, had to be transported from the police station to the county jail. And that meant walking past the gathered press. This was the perp walk, a modern-day ritual of public shaming. But for David Miller, it was not about shame. It was about the final, violent stripping away of the facade he had maintained for so long. As he was led out, his hands cuffed in front of him, a detective on each arm, the flashbulbs erupted. They popped like a swarm of aggressive fireflies, their light bleaching his pale, expressionless face. The shouts came from all directions, a barrage of questions he would never answer. "David, why did you do it? Did you think you'd get away with it? Do you have anything to say to Sarah Bennett's family?" He did not look at them. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground a few feet ahead, his face a carefully maintained blank. But the mask of the normal, unassuming family man was gone forever. In its place was the publicly identified killer. The cameras captured every detail. The cheap, borrowed jail jumpsuit, the disheveled hair, the empty, deadened eyes. The image would be on the evening news, in the morning papers, and across the internet within minutes. The ghost of 1995 had been given a face, and it was the face of a middle-aged man from the suburbs. For the community, it was a seismic shock. Neighbors who had waved at him for years, parents from his son's Little League team, co-workers, they all saw the footage. The mundane, boring, nice enough David Miller was a fiction. The reality was a monster who had lived among them, attended their barbecues, and coached their children, all while carrying the secret of a brutal murder. The trust in their quiet world was fractured, perhaps permanently. For Sarah Bennett's family and friends, watching from their homes, it was a moment of grim, tear-streaked vindication. After 28 years of uncertainty, of looking at every male face with a sliver of suspicion, the abstract evil had a name and a face. They saw him being led away, and though it could not bring her back, it finally gave them a target for their long-held grief and rage. The invisible wound was now visible. The fight was no longer with a ghost, it was with a man in handcuffs, being put into the back of a police car. The car door slammed shut, muffling the noise of the crowd. Inside, David Miller sat in silence as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving the media circus behind. He was now en route to a cell, to a new, infinitely smaller world defined by concrete and steel. But outside, the echoes of his walk of shame reverberated through the town. The story was no longer a cold case file. It was a living, breathing scandal. The man who had hidden in plain sight was now the most infamous resident in the county. His carefully constructed life was not just over. It was being publicly dissected, his every past interaction now re-evaluated under the horrifying new light of the truth. The walk was over in less than a minute, but it marked the end of his old life and the beginning of his new, notorious existence. The quiet man was quiet no more. The courtroom is a theater of conflict, and the trial of the state versus David Miller was its opening night. The air was thick with a tension that had been building for 28 years. On one side of the room sat the prosecution, their table laden with binders and exhibits, the entire weighty pyramid of evidence. On the other, the defense, armed with the only tool left to them, the sowing of doubt. The opening statements were not just legal formalities. They were the declaration of two irreconcilable realities. The lead prosecutor, a woman with a calm, formidable presence, stood before the jury. She did not shout. She spoke with the quiet confidence of someone holding all the cards. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and carrying. "This case is not a mystery. It is a story of a life stolen and a truth delayed. On April 12, 1995, the defendant, David Miller, went to the home of Sarah Bennett. He was not a stranger. He was an acquaintance. And when she, in her own home, likely rejected his advances or wounded his pride, he made a calculated decision. He did not leave. He did not yell. He killed her. He then crafted a lie, a performance of the concerned friend, and he lived that lie for 28 years, believing he was smarter than the system, that he was above consequence. She walked them through the pyramid, promise by promise. You will hear scientific evidence that places him in a violent struggle with Sarah Bennett. You will hear his own words, justifying this horrific act. This was not a crime of passion. This was a crime of pathological entitlement. He killed Sarah Bennett because she was a problem he felt entitled to eliminate. When she finished, the reality she painted, cold, calculated, and evil, hung heavily in the room. The defense attorney rose. His task was Herculean, to confront a mountain of evidence with little more than speculation. He adopted a posture of weary skepticism. "My client is not a monster," he began, spreading his hands. "He is a father, a husband, a man with no prior history of violence. What the prosecution calls a pyramid of evidence, I call a house of cards, built on assumptions and decades-old memories." He approached the jury box, his tone conspiratorial. "They will talk about DNA. But they cannot tell you how it got there. David Miller knew Sarah Bennett. He was in her apartment on other occasions. Could that DNA have been transferred innocently? Absolutely. They will talk about his calm demeanor. But people process shock in different ways. Is a man guilty because he didn't cry the way the police expected him to? He then launched his only viable counter-narrative, attacking the investigation. For 28 years, the police had one suspect, a random intruder. Now, they want to change the story. They ignored other leads. They focused on my client because new science gave them a name, but it didn't give them the how or the why. They took a tragic, unsolved crime and decided to pin it on the most convenient target, using a complex science that none of us truly understand. It was a feeble defense, a handful of dust thrown at a fortress. But it was his job to create a sliver of doubt, to suggest that the entire monumental case was a coincidence, a misunderstanding, a witch hunt. As both sides rested, the battle lines were drawn. In one corner, the overwhelming, multi-layered truth. In the other, the desperate, fading echo of a lie. The conflict was set. The jury would now have to decide which world they lived in. The heart of the trial, the moment the entire case turned upon, arrived with the quiet authority of a lab-coated expert witness. Dr. Eleanor Reed, a geneticist with a demeanor as precise as the science she represented, took the stand. The courtroom, which had buzzed with the abstract drama of opening statements, fell into a hushed, attentive silence. This was no longer about stories. It was about strands of DNA. The prosecutor began gently, leading Dr. Reed through the basics. She explained DNA not as a complex chemical, but as a biological blueprint, a unique barcode for every individual. Then, she presented the first exhibit, the DNA profile developed from the crime scene evidence in 1995. It was a series of peaks and valleys on a graph, an indecipherable ghost to the layperson. And this profile, Dr. Reed, the prosecutor asked, who does it belong to? This is the profile of the unknown male contributor to the biological material found on and around the victim, Sarah Bennett, she stated. For 28 years, it remained unknown. Then came the foundation. The prosecutor displayed a new series of charts and family trees on the screen. Dr. Reed meticulously, patiently, explained the process of forensic genetic genealogy. She described it as building a massive, anonymous family tree from the roots up. She showed how the unknown DNA profile was compared to public databases, generating a list of distant relatives, third cousins, half-great aunts, all connected to the same unknown source. It's like having 1,000 scattered pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, all from the same box, but without the picture on the lid, she analogized. Our job was to assemble the edges, the sky, the background, until the shape of the missing centerpiece, the identity of the contributor, became clear. She walked the jury through the painstaking process of building out the family trees of these DNA matches, of finding the shared ancestors, and then moving forward through the generations, eliminating branches based on age, gender, and location. With each step, the circle tightened. The screen showed a complex genealogical chart, with lines converging like tributaries into a single, named river, David Miller. And to be absolutely certain, the prosecutor said, what was the final step? We obtained a known sample from the defendant, David Miller, Dr. Reed said. A direct comparison was made. She brought the two DNA profiles, the one from 1995 and the one from Miller's coffee cup, onto the screen side by side. Then, with a click, she superimposed them. The lines matched perfectly, peak for peak, valley for valley. It was a visual symphony of certainty. The DNA from the 1995 crime scene, Dr. Reed concluded, her voice leaving no room for ambiguity, is a definitive match to the defendant. The probability of it belonging to anyone else is astronomically remote, on the order of 1 in several quadrillion. During cross-examination, the defense attorney rose, his task daunting. He could not attack the science itself. It was unassailable. Instead, he tried to attack the process. He questioned the privacy implications of public databases. He asked if it was possible that the DNA had been transferred innocently weeks before the murder. Dr. Reed was unmoved. The sample was recovered from beneath the victim's fingernails, consistent with defensive contact during a violent struggle. This is not the result of a casual handshake or a hug. This is the result of a life-or-death fight. When the defense suggested the evidence could have been contaminated over the decades, she explained the chain of custody and the rigorous protocols of the lab. Each of his fumbling attempts to create doubt only served to let Dr. Reed reinforce the rock-solid reliability of her findings. The foundational clue had not just been presented, it had been enshrined. It was no longer a theory or a detective's hunch. It was a mathematical truth, delivered with calm, unshakable authority. As Dr. Reed stepped down from the stand, the pyramid of evidence no longer felt like a metaphor. It felt like a physical object in the room, and David Miller was trapped beneath its weight. The jury had seen the ghost given a name, and that name was his. The clinical presentation of evidence was over. The DNA profiles, the timelines, the psychological analyses, they had built the factual case for guilt. But now, the courtroom was about to be filled with something no science could quantify: the human cost. It was time for the victim impact statements. The law gave Sarah Bennett's family and friends the right to address the man who had shattered their world. The first to approach the podium was Sarah's mother. She seemed both diminished and immense, weighted by a grief that had been her constant companion for nearly 3 decades. Her hands trembled as she held her statement, but her voice, when it came, was clear and sharp with a pain that had been polished by time. "For 28 years, she began, her eyes fixed not on the judge, but on David Miller, who stared blankly at the table before him, "I have not had a single day of peace. You didn't just kill my daughter that night. You killed me, in 1,000 different ways, every day since." She spoke of the empty chair at every holiday, a silence so loud it was deafening. She described the agony of outliving her child, of watching her friends become grandparents while she was left with only photographs and a headstone to visit. "I don't get to miss the woman she became," she said, her voice breaking. "I only get to mourn the girl she was, and dream of a future I was robbed of ever seeing. You stole her laughter from my world, and you left only this endless, quiet ache." Next, Sarah's best friend, the one from the coffee shop, stepped forward. Her grief was rawer, angrier. "We were supposed to grow old and be ridiculous together," she said, tears of rage and sorrow streaming down her face. "We had plans. We were going to sail the Mediterranean, remember? You took my first call when I got engaged. You were supposed to be the maid of honor at my wedding. You were supposed to be the fun aunt to my children." She looked directly at Miller, who refused to meet her gaze. "My children know your name, Sarah. But they know it as a tragedy. A story of a beautiful auntie they never got to meet because of that man." She pointed a trembling finger at the defendant. "You didn't just murder my best friend. You murdered a part of me. You murdered the person I was when I was with her." One by one, they came forward. A cousin who remembered her kindness. An uncle who spoke of her potential. Each voice added another layer to the monument of a life that had been lost, and detailed the crater of sorrow that remained. Throughout it all, David Miller did not look up. He showed no emotion. No flicker of remorse. No twitch of discomfort. He was a stone in a river of anguish, unmoved and unmoving. His inability to even acknowledge their pain was, in its own way, a final, silent confession, proof of the profound lack of empathy that had made the murder possible. As the last family member returned to their seat, a heavy, exhausted silence fell over the courtroom. The facts had proven his guilt. But these statements had defined his crime. They had translated the legal term homicide back into its human meaning, a void that could never be filled, a symphony of pain whose notes would echo for a lifetime. The cost of David Miller's bruised ego was not a single night of violence. It was a legacy of endless, daily sorrow. The jury was out for less than a day. The deliberation was not a debate over guilt, but a meticulous review of the mountain of evidence, a final, collective acknowledgment of its irrefutable weight. When the bailiff informed the court that a verdict had been reached, the air in the courtroom became brittle, as if a single breath could shatter it. Sarah Bennett's family held hands, their knuckles white, their faces etched with a lifetime of anticipation and dread. David Miller was led to his seat, his face the same impassive mask he had worn throughout the trial. He did not look at the jury as they filed in, their own faces solemn and avoidant of his gaze. The judge spoke. "Mr. Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." A piece of paper was passed. The judge read it, his expression unchanging, and handed it to the clerk. The clerk, a woman with a neutral, professional tone, began to read. On the count of murder in the first degree in the death of Sarah Bennett, we the jury find the defendant, David Miller. A heartbeat of silence stretched into an eternity. Guilty. The word landed not with a bang, but with a profound, world-shifting finality. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on 28 years of uncertainty. From the gallery, there was a collective shuddering exhale, a sob, a gasp, a whispered, "Thank God." Sarah's mother closed her eyes, her body slumping in relief, the tension of a decades-long vigil finally releasing its grip. David Miller showed no reaction. He simply blinked, his head dipping in a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an admission of guilt, but an acknowledgement of a system's conclusion. He had been caught. It was a data point. The judge called for order and moved directly to sentencing. He gave Miller the opportunity to speak. Miller declined, shaking his head almost dismissively. He had nothing to say to the family he had destroyed, no words for the court he had eluded for so long. The judge then turned his gaze to Miller, his voice imbued with the full weight of his office and the accumulated grief of the case. "David Miller," he began, his tone low and grave. "The jury has found you guilty of one of the most heinous crimes this court has ever seen. You took a life of boundless potential to soothe your own pathological pride. You then compounded this evil by living a lie for 28 years, forcing a family to endure a pain that is unimaginable to any parent, any friend, any loved one." He detailed the aggravation, the calculation, the lack of remorse, the decades of deception. "You are the embodiment of a cold, narcissistic evil that is, thankfully, rare in our society. You are a predator who did not lurk in shadows, but in the plain light of everyday life." He took a final breath, his pronouncement echoing the one from our cold open. "It is the judgment of this court that you be imprisoned for the remainder of your natural life, with no possibility of parole. And to ensure that the magnitude of your crime is recognized, this sentence shall be served consecutively to another term of life imprisonment. 2 life sentences. One for the life you took, and one for the decades of life you stole from those who loved her." The gavel fell. Crack. This time, the sound was not a prelude, but a period. It was the end of the line. As the bailiffs moved to lead him away, David Miller stood. He offered one last empty glance around the room, a look that saw people not as human beings, but as obstacles that had finally been overcome by the system. Then he turned and disappeared through the side door, back to the cages that would be his world until the day he died. The long, dark road that began in 1995 had finally reached its end. Justice, delayed for a generation, had arrived. A verdict cannot restore a stolen life. A prison sentence cannot fill a void that has lasted for decades. But in the wake of the crushing finality of the courtroom, something else can emerge, a legacy. A way for the light of a lost life to continue cutting through the darkness. Sarah Bennett's family and friends refused to let David Miller have the final word. They refused to let her be defined solely by her murder. Instead, they chose to define her by her life. With the closure that justice finally brought, they established the Sarah Bennett Memorial Scholarship. It is awarded annually to a promising graduate student in education, a recipient who embodies Sarah's own passion for teaching and her belief in the potential of every child. Each year, a new young educator, armed with books and ideas and hope, enters a classroom, their path partially paved by Sarah's memory. Her love of learning now fuels the futures of others, creating a ripple effect of good that will extend for generations. Her case also became a catalyst. The successful use of forensic genetic genealogy in solving a decades-old local cold case spurred the department to create a dedicated cold case task force, re-examining other forgotten files with new technological eyes. Sarah's name became synonymous with a renewed pursuit of justice, not just for her, but for other victims whose voices had been silenced. And in the quiet moments, her legacy is more personal. Her best friend, now a mother, tells her children stories about their Aunt Sarah, not as a victim, but as the vibrant, funny, and fiercely loyal woman she was. Her mother finds solace in tending the scholarship fund, in meeting the bright young students who carry a piece of her daughter's dream forward. David Miller tried to erase Sarah Bennett. He failed. He is now a number in the prison system, his story ended, his name destined only for true crime archives. But Sarah's story continues. It continues in every lesson plan inspired by her scholarship, in every cold case reopened because of her, and in every memory shared by those who loved her. The killer is confined to a past of his own making. The victim's legacy, however, lives firmly and beautifully in the present. The ripples of a single crime can, over time, change the shape of the shore. The murder of Sarah Bennett and the dramatic, decades-later conviction of David Miller did more than just solve a cold case. It became a landmark event that altered the landscape of criminal justice in the state. The most significant impact was the formal adoption of what media outlets dubbed the Bennett Protocol. This was a piece of state legislation that allocated dedicated annual funding for the re-examination of cold cases using forensic genetic genealogy. No longer would departments have to rely on grants or discretionary budgets. The protocol made it a mandated priority. Sarah's name became synonymous with a promise to other families waiting in the purgatory of unsolved murders, that their cases would not be forgotten, and that science would be relentlessly applied to bring them answers. Beyond the legislation, the case forced a profound ethical and operational reckoning within law enforcement. The stunning success of genetic genealogy in a case with such a degraded sample proved its power beyond a shadow of a doubt. District attorneys who were once skeptical now actively sought out cases suitable for review. The Bennett case was cited in courtrooms across the country as a precedent for the admissibility and reliability of the method, breaking down legal barriers and paving the way for a new wave of justice. It also changed the public's perception of cold cases. They were no longer seen as dead files, but as sleeping investigations, waiting for the right key to unlock them. The story of Sarah Bennett became a testament to the notion that time does not erase truth. It only makes the pursuit of it more urgent. Her case demonstrated that a killer's greatest mistake is not in the act itself, but in the arrogance of believing that time is on their side. The societal impact was a collective shift from resignation to resolution, a belief that no crime is ever truly cold, only waiting for its moment to be solved. David Miller's world is now measured in concrete and steel. He is inmate #78Y340, residing in a maximum security prison, a human specimen placed in permanent storage. His life is a monotonous cycle of head counts, meals served through a slot, and 1 hour of daily recreation in a cramped, high-walled yard under the watchful eyes of armed guards. He receives no visitors. His wife, upon learning the full, grotesque truth during the trial, divorced him immediately. His children, whose lives he helped create while hiding his secret, have disowned him, their own identities now painfully intertwined with his infamy. He is utterly alone, a man defined by a single evil act, now severed from the very world he sought to deceive. Prison psychologists who have assessed him describe him as a model prisoner, in the most clinical sense. He causes no trouble, follows the rules, and keeps to himself. But this is not rehabilitation. It is the same pathological self-preservation he has always exhibited. He has simply adapted his mask to a new environment. In rare, sanctioned interviews, he never expresses remorse for Sarah Bennett's death. He speaks only of the injustice of his situation, of the broken system that caught him. He is the perpetual victim, his narcissism now encased in a concrete shell, forever reflecting back on itself. His fate is not one of dramatic suffering or poetic justice, but of profound emptiness. He will wake up in the same cell, day after day, for the rest of his natural life. There will be no parole hearings, no hope of release, only the slow, grinding passage of time. The man who thought he could control his narrative has had all control permanently stripped away. He is a cautionary tale, a name in a database, a body taking up space until it finally ceases to function. His legacy is nothingness. So, we return to the haunting, central question. Why? The evidence gave us the how. The psychology gave us the reason. But the true why remains a dark echo in a hollow man. David Miller did not kill for money, for passion, or for power in any traditional sense. He killed because his pathological narcissism could not tolerate a world that did not conform to his ego's fragile demands. Sarah Bennett was not a person to him. She was a mirror, and when she reflected back an image he found insulting, a simple, human moment of rejection, his only recourse was to shatter the glass. He fixed his problem, with the cold, transactional logic of a sociopath, believing the annihilation of a life was a fair price to pay for the restoration of his own delicate self-worth. The greatest terror of this story is not the monster in the shadows, but the one who mows his lawn on Saturdays. It forces us to confront the chilling reality that the most profound evil is not always grand or theatrical. Sometimes it is quiet, entitled, and utterly, terrifyingly mundane. It is the belief that another human being is nothing more than an obstacle to your own sense of comfort. And in that belief, we see the true and final why.